Welcome. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. Joining us here on the program today is author of an interesting book that talks about the possibility of a great American collapse. This gentleman is joining us here on the program today, was witness to the Soviet collapse in the late 80s and early 90s, and seen what the society did as they not only collapsed, but also found ways to rebuild and reinvent themselves. The warning signs are possibly here that the United States is headed in the same direction, so what do we do about it? I'd like to welcome to the program today our guest, author of Reinventing Collapse, Dmitry Orlov. And Dmitry, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Thank you, Daniel. Great to be with you.
Now, what was it that you experienced? What were the signs that you seen in the Soviet Union that they were not only headed for collapse, but then inevitably it did happen?
There were a few portends that if people actually paid attention to them at the time, they could have predicted it a little better instead of being blindsided by the entire event. And one of these was that production of crude oil on the territory of the Soviet Union peaked about 2 or 3 years before the collapse due to technological and geologic constraints. And the Soviet Union was very dependent on exports of crude oil in order to earn the foreign currency it needed to keep its economy afloat. And the thing that followed that was a process of taking on debt, foreign debt, at an entirely unsustainable level, so that eventually foreign investors started walking away, and the Soviet Union was basically left at their mercy. It didn't really matter whether it had a foreign policy anymore because their foreign policy was dictated by their creditors beyond a certain point. As far as the process of collapse itself, some of the things that people should have been paying attention to but weren't is the center, Moscow, was no longer able to subsidize, i.e. bail out, all of the various Soviet socialist republics and democratic republics that were part of the Eastern Bloc. And because of that, the project of Soviet empire basically was short of resources and could not continue, so that East Germany and Hungary and the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia at the time basically started walking away at various rates and were no longer part of the Moscow program. So those are all the things people should have been paying attention to, and hindsight is 20/20. So now we can actually pay attention to these as they unfold in the American context.
Now, let's take a look at the signs that we certainly see in America that are almost related and parallel to what the Soviet experience was like.
Right. Well, the first thing to look at is crude oil. Crude oil production is more or less flat, has been since 2005. Very high oil prices have been unable to increase oil production. We lose about 4 million barrels per day of production every year of the old resource, which is the cheap oil that we're used to, which is, say, below something like $60 a barrel. And it can be made up maybe by exploiting very expensive oil, very deep offshore, for instance, in the deep Gulf of Mexico, or very dirty and environmentally destructive and ineffective sources such as, for instance, the Athabascan tar sands.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, cheap oil is gone, and oil that can be brought on stream now will be so expensive nobody can afford it. So the predicament is the same. It's not really the volume of oil that matters. It's the amount of energy and treasure that has to be invested in getting the soil versus the amount of treasure that the soil can generate. And so it just doesn't really make sense anymore. Like basically the whole industrial infrastructure is not going to grow any bigger. So that limits economic growth. And then at the same time, we can look at the level of debt. The United States now is the world's single largest debtor nation. And the only conceivable way that it can continue making payments on its debt is if the U.S. economy continues to grow. Now, if you look at the preceding statement of the oil being constrained, this economy isn't going to grow because it depends so much on transportation fuels, because all of the infrastructure is car-based. And so there isn't really much of an opportunity to service this outlandish debt, which basically means that the United States will have to default on it in one way or another. In terms of sort of the political unwinding, if you look at the fiscal situation of the various states, California is a prime example. You know, it's basically the largest economy within the United States. It is basically bankrupt at the municipal level, at the state and municipal level. It has been forced to more or less print its own money. Nobody even talks about the federal government actually stepping in and bailing out, because that would bankrupt the federal government in a rather, spectacular fashion very quickly. So there's an avoidance of discussing those realities. And this is basically, California is a state that leads the nation in many different ways, and this is just one of them. So this is what we should expect to see across the country, is basically states going their own ways because Washington is no longer useful for them.
It's really fascinating as you read through Reinventing Collapse. There's a part of me that goes, God, this all seems like doom and gloom, and is there any kind of a lighter way up? But you also show how the Soviet Union in many areas kind of stayed somewhat buoyant during their collapse because of particular infrastructures that helped them not go too far down into the hole. One of them you were talking about was public transportation versus the way we are here in America, where we all have the need for our cars and our SUVs and motorhomes. Talk about how some of the things that they had in place didn't make it too severe, even though it happened anyway.
Well, I think it's a very important point to absorb. The Soviet Union was very well prepared for collapse in terms of its internal functioning, in terms of the systems that were built, as opposed to the United States, which is completely unprepared for collapse. The Soviet Union had many systems that never worked particularly well, and so once collapse happened, they continued to not work particularly well. Whereas the United States has many systems that supposedly work really quite well. It's possible to overstate that point as well, of course. But the whole point is that, once things really start to unwind, there's no chance of them continuing to work at all, at any level. There's just basically too much fragility built into the system. So one example is that when there was mass unemployment and nobody could afford much of anything, people still had a roof over their heads because they didn't own the place that they lived. The bank didn't own it. The government did, and the government just basically made apartments available to people. They were assigned a place to live, and whether they paid rent or not was immaterial. So everybody had a roof over their heads, even when they were just basically destitute. There was no homelessness associated with mass unemployment. Another related issue is that all of this housing stock was built on public transportation lines, so that people didn't have to have private transportation in order to get around. And the public transportation, it wasn't very comfortable. It didn't necessarily run on time all the time, but it got you around instead of leaving people stranded, which is what happens around here if people lose access to their private automobile. There are many other similar types of situations. For instance, in the United States, food is all based on refrigerated diesel trucks and just-in-time delivery. It takes about 3 days for supermarket shelves to be stripped bare, and nothing happens until FEMA, federal emergency, shows up and starts handing out food. Now that's great, except FEMA can't cover the entire country at once. They can do New Orleans, maybe they can do parts of Southern California that happen to be on fire at any given time, but they can't do the whole country at once. So that's not really a viable fallback. In Russia, there were local food stockpiles all over the place, plus the food distribution in Russia wasn't very good ever, so people grew a lot of their own food, even during normal times. So they just basically turned to very serious gardening when the usual supplies of food more or less dwindled to nothing. There were some types of foodstuffs that were always supplied. You could always get a few things. You could get pasta, you could get bread. There were a few canned goods that were always available. So there was really no starvation. It wasn't a very good diet necessarily, but it was a diet. It wasn't that people were just basically cut off from sources of food. And there are many other similar things. Socialized medicine in Russia was very good at controlling infectious diseases and a few other things, but people joke that it was the freest healthcare in the world. In terms of you getting nothing for nothing, but it still kept people alive. Whereas here we have this incredibly expensive and very, very inefficient system that is designed basically to enrich a certain class of people. It's not really designed to deliver health care. And so more and more people are basically being cut off from sources, just really basic stuff, like, trying to get, antibiotics for strep throat, can cost you hundreds of dollars and absolutely ridiculous situations that the rest of the world has learned to avoid, but this country hasn't. And
it's interesting you bring it that way, because when you take a look when President Barack Obama was running for office and was taking a look at how to deal with, for instance, the health care reform, then you're hearing the other side starting to scream, oh, socialist, he wants a socialist country. But then, in fact, you start getting messages from different countries around the world like, who are these idiots that are mocking this particular system that generally seems to be working?
Well, I think it's basically a big mistake to think that there are sides to a political debate in the United States. There is no political debate, and there are no sides.
Right, but see, in America we love that because we love sports. So there tends to be one side wins, one side loses, and the fact is, well, you're supposed to be working for the people in general. What's going on here?
Well, supposed to is I think the operative word there. Basically, I was in Washington last weekend, and I wasn't there to demonstrate or anything like that. That's kind of like a big waste of time as far as I'm concerned. But I looked at the demonstrators, and I found them really strange because they were all almost identical. Like, basically, it was a bunch of clones. They were all white. There was not a single Hispanic. They were all sort of a little bit over the hill. Like, the percentage of pretty women in the crowd was exactly 0.
Right.
Okay. Now, back in the old days when I did go to demonstrations once in a while, I was single then. I did it to pick up women because, there were a lot of pretty women at these anti-war demonstrations, etc. This was not the case. These were all very lumpy, kind of schlubby people. And there are a few other odd things that I noticed. Like, basically, they were walking around with real estate signs. I actually saw a pile of them sitting there that didn't get used, and they said things like office space for lease and condos for sale starting at $300,000. Lots of them. And they were all identical, same form factor piece of corrugated cardboard, printed on one side and blank on the other. So I guess they put 2 of them together with blank sides facing out and then scribbled on one of them. And then they were stapled to basically I think just a sharp pine stake, sharpened at one end, designed to be driven into a piece of turf. So they were all walking around with these identical signs. And it occurred to me that they were basically just all following orders. Somebody just, shipped them in and gave them a pile of signs to scribble on, and the things they scribbled on the signs are just completely irrelevant. They could have just been walking around Washington, the mall with signs that said office space for lease. The effect would have been the same.
That's, it's really fascinating to think about how we tend to do things there. Now, just as I was saying, in your book, you tend to paint a picture that almost seems very grim, but then you show the areas that if people would actually prepare themselves in particular ways, that that they can stay buoyant when a situation like this happens. And what's interesting is that you were saying in your book that Americans actually believe that we need money to survive, to live. Talk about that relationship there.
Well, this is something that I think helped the Russians immeasurably. The fact that there wasn't this overarching obsession with money, so that when people, a lot of them became more or less penniless, they lost all of their money because the money was worthless. On the one hand, their salaries were held back for many months. On the other hand, and a lot of them lost jobs because a lot of businesses, places closed. It didn't really affect them psychologically that much. They really didn't have a self-image that was based on how much money they had relative to other people. Some of them did, but not too many. It was really the status was derived from other things, positions in society, and there's some problems with that too, obviously. But a lot of people were really important to the functioning of society, basically took care of the money problem in whatever way they had to at any particular time, but they weren't psychologically devastated by the lack of money. Whereas in the United States, people really just think in terms of money as the absolutely essential thing, the thing they need to keep evil at bay, to keep their families safe, etc. And also they have a very difficult time imagining how things might work without money. That is, they can't imagine how they might function alongside other people if they didn't have any money. Mm-hmm. So these are all things that basically are very, there are a lot of patterns that are very hard to unlearn. And then it's a different set of patterns, for instance, how to barter, how to exchange favors, how to live in a gift economy as opposed to a money economy. And those skills take half a lifetime to acquire. So if you don't have them, then you're not in a very good situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you mentioned in Reinventing collapse, or you talked about how the Soviet Union, when it came to money, that if somebody's neighbor or friend just said, I might need this, they just simply gave without really much of an expectation of return, where in America we tend to get into more of a hoarding mentality. It's all for me, and then if maybe I have enough left over, then maybe I might share some of that with you, but otherwise you're on your own.
Yeah, there were a lot of patterns in Russian life. For instance, the ultimate toy was a private automobile. People didn't drive them much. They basically sat in these little tin shack garages that dotted the outskirts of cities. Maybe they would drive them a few weekends a year, that sort of thing. But a lot of people were very proud of their little Ladas, mostly. And to buy one was very difficult. There was no way to get an official loan, so people borrowed money from their friends. So that was kind of the pattern. Is you thought you're rich enough, you had a bit of excess money, so you would flaunt your wealth a bit and line up for a car, and like 3 years later it would be delivered. And in the meantime, you scrape together the payment, one lump sum payment, by borrowing it from all your friends. So patterns like that existed. Basically informal self-help and mutual help kinds of frameworks were just very widespread, and there wasn't really an official finance industry, whereas the United States is very much over-financed, and everything is very official, and from the point of view of raising money, very expensive.
Now, the other thing, too, is you take a look at this collapse that seems to be on the horizon, or some of the ideas of how people will either stay settled or become nomadic, but then you got to take a look at, for instance, emergency systems as well. And this even goes all the way to police enforcement. This even goes to paramilitary protection. It goes so forth and so on. And you describe how these people will tend to be sort of in a situation to be able to provide protection, sort of like you're paying for a bully to be able to take care of business just in case you need somebody.
Well, yes, there was a period of time in Russia where police protection was more or less non-existent, kind of like it is in Flint, Michigan right now, where lots of I don't remember what the exact percentage of murders that have been solved in Flint this year out of the hundreds, but it's pretty low. Like they aren't really catching the criminals. In Flint, you get away with murder all the time, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
So that was basically the situation in many parts of Russia. And so what people did was basically have a lot of security arrangements where people would look out for each other. The police were basically available for rent for special occasions, and you wanted to be friends with them. It wasn't so much bribes because as just a kind of a informal sharing a lot of the time, people exchanging favors, because the police weren't getting paid enough to really live on, so they had to make money, and that was basically the pattern. Now, keep in mind that Russian Soviet society, except some really unhappy ethnic enclaves, mostly in the south, was a placid place. People didn't really have a lot of weapons. The murder rate was really, really low compared to the United States. And so when things got bad, there was basically an upper limit to how bad they got, set by the number of these bad people, let's say, or armed people, or people with violent tendencies that were just running around. Whereas the murder rate in the United States in a lot of areas and overall is sky high during the best of times. So we can expect.
Oh no.
Yeah. Basically, this country and South Africa have the highest murder rates in the world. There are a few other places that are just almost as bad. I think Iraq, on a bad day, is worse. But it's really outrageous, and most people just blithely ignore that. And, but this really means that a lot of the United States, the most distressed places, especially, will just not be survivable for a large number of people.
Dmitry, I'm just wondering, in your observation, when you were saying that the Soviet Union, the people tend to be just kind of mellow, that murder rates are extremely low, but yet here in the United States, we just go crazy for it. What do you think it is? What is the difference between the two superpowers, if you will, that we see such prevalent violence in America?
Well, I think that, in many places in the world, the means of social control is to make people afraid of the government. So the government has a monopoly on violence. They have the weapons. They can shoot you if they want. You have no recourse, and excuse me, and therefore you will behave. and that's useful, but that's not as useful as making people afraid of each other, because then you can make money off of them, because they're willing to part with treasure to feel a little bit more safe. So that's the pattern in the United States. It's basically profit-driven, and so it is profitable to make people afraid, and that is the pattern here.
Quite interesting here. Now, let's talk about emergency services during the collapse. We just kind of touched on, again, police protection, but let's talk about some of the other emergency services that during a collapse, if there isn't a proper infrastructure, of course, that you're going to see a lot more problems, but then what the solution is to that.
Well, there aren't really a lot of solutions that I can just sort of trot out.
Because when you take a look at Hurricane Katrina, that gives you an idea of just how ready we are to take care of ourselves.
Oh yeah, no. Beyond any doubt, many parts of the United States are basically not survivable without the life support infrastructure. There are parts of the country where if air conditioning fails during the summer, a lot of people die. There was nothing comparable in Russia except for heat. And again, heat was provided as part of a municipal infrastructure that had nothing to do with finance or even tax collection. It was basically just a part of the planned economy, and it continued to run. Some places froze, but not that many. And so I would say that in this country, the best you can do is basically either live in a dense enough place that will probably hold together, or live in a very sparsely populated place surrounded by people who will take care of you. But the stuff in the middle, suburbia, is probably not very survivable.
So gated communities might stand a chance at, well, sustaining but not necessarily thriving.
I'm not so sure about gated communities, but I think cities, like more or less dense city neighborhoods, have enough talent locally and enough resources locally, and maybe some social cohesion, because people don't just like see each other drive around. They actually, rub shoulders some of the time, and they actually might know each other's names. But they might actually be able to self-organize, to take care of themselves and each other. Whereas in suburbia, where everyone basically is an automobile with a human body inside, trapped inside, there's really no society. It's a society of cars, not a society of people. So once the car society infrastructure unravels, there's nothing. People don't even know their neighbors.
Tell you, a very interesting book, Reinventing Collapse is the title, The Soviet Example and American Prospects. Now, Dmitry, as this book has been put out there, what kind of response have you been getting from people who have read it and they talk to you about it?
Well, the response has been really quite powerful. I've done numerous talk shows. Stuff that I've put out has been downloaded millions of times. My blog gets about 1 million visitors a year. I have to write more. In fact, when I neglect my blog for a little while, people start writing and asking me what happened. A lot of people are taking this very, very seriously and are taking actual concrete steps to basically provide a future for themselves, because they don't see the default, which is basically continuing with the way things are, as in any way standing a chance of working.
Like I said, very interesting book, folks, and if you don't think it's going to happen, well, that's generally what happens to somebody who ends up frozen as they go, well, I didn't think it happened to me, but it's about to happen to a lot of us. And, you not only, let people know in a very serious way, this is what's going on here, and these are some of the things to be aware of, but you also provide solutions or ways that a person can become more sustainable. And certainly we get away from the American individualistic idea of getting the American dream for ourselves, and then again, maybe we've got enough left over to share with someone else. But it really comes back to us getting back to community again, being able to, to share just as the Soviet Union did. Do you see America being able to rebound from something like this?
I don't see America as a whole being able to rebound from anything. I think that it is basically a good name for a continent that consists of two pieces, North America and South America. And as far as the United States, of non-Mexican United States, because there's also I don't think that it's really a viable entity on the political map moving forward. I really don't see it as being that significant. Now, there's a lot of institutional inertia, but I think the writing is on the wall, and I don't think it's long for this world.
Well, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the Beyond 50 radio program. What are you going to be up to here in the near future?
Well, I have some very sort of practical projects having to do with boats that I'm working on, and I'll probably devote a lot of effort to that. And I'm also planning to write another book that basically is along the same lines as my first book, but gets into more detail about the various stages of collapse, the working out of it, and what people can do at each stage in the constructive action that people can take in their own lives, in the lives of their communities. There's been basically a flood of questions coming in and a lot of discussion, and so there's really a lot of material to cover.
The book is Reinventing Collapse. Our guest today, Dmitry Orlov. And Dmitry, thank you for taking the time to be here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
You bet. So, just like the old maxim from the Boy Scouts says, folks, be prepared and know what you're being prepared for. Reinventing Collapse could certainly be a particular eye-opener to get you going in that direction. I want to thank you for tuning in. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter where we do post this information as well as our radio archives. Be sure to also pass this information on to friends and other people that you know could use it. Thank you again for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.